In the desolate heart of Wyoming Territory, late January 1877, a piercing cry shattered the frozen silence of the Snowhorn Mountains. Could there be life amidst this brutal wilderness, where the wind howled with the ferocity of a wounded beast? Silas Grers, a solitary rancher hardened by the relentless frontier, reined in his horse, the snow crunching beneath its hooves like brittle glass. His ears, attuned to the mournful songs of the wild, caught a sound far more delicate, far more desperate, a baby's wail, fragile yet insistent, echoing from the timberline. Not just one cry, but several, intertwining in a haunting chorus of need. Dismounting with urgency, Silas scanned the untouched path, a jagged wound through the ancient trees. His boots plunged deep into the snow with every determined step, his breath escaping in sharp, frosty clouds as he guided his horse by the reins. The cries grew sharper, more heart-wrenching, leading him to a clearing where an old fence post, half-rotted and entombed in ice, stood as a grim sentinel. There, bound cruelly to it with barbed wire, was a woman, barely alive, her wrists torn and bleeding, snow clinging to her frozen lashes and the edges of her matted hair. Her face, pale as the ghostly moon, bore the violent bloom of bruises across her cheekbones, her lips cracked and trembling. At her feet lay 3 tiny bundles, newborns, no more than a day old, wrapped in the tattered remnants of a nightgown. One whimpered faintly, a thread of life. The others lay silent, their stillness a dagger to the soul. Her head tilted weakly, her voice a mere breath. "Don't let them take my daughters." Without a second thought, Silas knelt beside her, stripping off his gloves to check the infants. Their breathing was shallow, their skin chilled to the bone. "You're coming with me," he murmured, his voice a quiet vow amidst the storm. Her gaze wavered, heavy and deliberate, as if comprehending his words demanded every ounce of her fading strength. Silas, unwavering, pulled a blade from the worn leather of his boot and severed the cruel barbed wire that ensnared her. It had clawed deep into the tender flesh of her forearms, leaving angry, jagged wounds. Crimson bloomed where the rusted metal had torn free, yet she uttered not a cry, nor did she recoil in pain. Her stoicism pierced him. As her knees buckled beneath her, he swiftly encircled her waist, anchoring her trembling frame against his own. Her body sagged, burdened by exhaustion and the relentless seep of blood. Without a moment's delay, Silas lifted her into his arms, her fragile form pressed close to his chest, a shield against the world. Then, with tender urgency, he turned to the infants. One by one, he gathered their tiny, shivering bodies, nestling the smallest within the folds of his weathered coat, binding them securely with a coarse woolen blanket from his saddle. They scarcely moved, their breaths shallow in the biting cold. A fierce wind howled across the desolate expanse, slashing at them with icy talons. Silas hunched over, using his broad frame to guard them as best he could. His horse pawed the frozen ground, restless and uneasy. His eyes darted to the horizon. Half a mile lay ahead, an uphill trek to his cabin through merciless snow. Adjusting his hold on Marivavel, securing the infants tighter, he murmured into the gale, or perhaps to a higher power. "Not her. Not these little ones. Death has no claim here, not on my soil." With painstaking care, he mounted his horse, positioning her before him, the babies cradled between their weary bodies. She was light as a whisper, the infants frail as frost-bitten hares. The cold had sapped their strength, and time was a ruthless adversary. The path back dragged on, the wind a ceaseless tormentor, yet Silas pressed forward, undeterred. Who was she? What horrors hunted her? Such questions had no place now. Only the desperate need to keep her heart beating mattered. As they reached the cabin, darkness cloaked its walls, the hearth long extinguished. Silas shouldered the door open with a forceful kick, bore her inside, and laid her down with the gentlest of hands on a threadbare cot. As the echoes of the harrowing journey faded into the cabin's sturdy embrace, Silas settled the fragile lives he had rescued near the hearth's comforting glow. The infants, tiny and vulnerable, were nestled into a basket cushioned with soft rabbit pelts, their faint breaths a quiet testament to survival. With steady hands that refused to tremble under the weight of the moment, Silas turned to coax the fire, stirring its embers into a fierce, defiant dance of warmth. Beyond the cabin's walls, the relentless snow drifted down, veiling the cruel path that had led to such suffering. Yet within, under the flickering firelight, Silas moved with a quiet resolve, a guardian in the storm. A stranger had been abandoned to fate's merciless grip, but not here, not under his watchful care, not on his sacred ground. This humble cabin, little more than rough-hewn timber and a sagging roof burdened by winter's weight, stood as a fortress against despair. It was dry, and the fire Silas Granger had breathed into life now roared with purpose, its heat creeping outward to wrestle the icy chill that clung stubbornly to the room's shadowed edges. Silas shed his sodden coat, hanging it near the flames, and stripped off his gloves to reveal hands scarred and weathered by toil. In the corner, Medell lay motionless on a makeshift bed of woolen blankets, her lips tinged with a ghostly blue, her hands bound loosely in linen strips. Since their arrival, she hadn't stirred, hadn't whispered a single sign of life. The babies murmured softly, their weak cries piercing the silence, yet affirming their fragile hold on existence. Silas prepared nourishment with care, pouring goat's milk from a hidden jug into an iron pot to warm over the fire. He set out a pine-carved spoon and a tin bowl, tools of tender mercy. Then, with a heavy heart, he approached the broken woman. Her breaths were shallow, barely there. Dipping a cloth into warm water, he gently wiped away the crusted blood from her battered ankles and calves. The bruise's dark, vicious blooms of purple and black spoke of cruelty beyond imagining. Who could inflict such pain? Her knees, scraped to rawness, bore the marks of torment. With each careful touch, Silas tended to her wounds, a silent vow woven into every gesture. As the warmth of the fire flickered in the dim room, Silas gently tugged the frayed edge of the blanket over her trembling legs once more. She remained lost in slumber, her breaths faint yet steady, a fragile rhythm in the quiet night. He turned to the pot where milk simmered softly and ladled a portion into a dented tin bowl. Testing it against the back of his weathered hand, he winced, still too scalding. Patience was his only ally as he waited, his gaze fixed on the tiniest of the babies, whose cries had grown desperate, piercing the stillness with frail, insistent pleas. Kneeling by the crude cradle, Silas reached in, his rough fingers brushing against the infant's skin, warm now, a whisper of hope amidst the hardship. With a spoon, he offered the child small sips of milk, her clumsy gulps soon turning ravenous. He tended to the other two with the same tender care, pausing to wipe their tiny mouths and nestle the blankets snugly around their delicate heads. Then, a faint rustle broke his focus. From the bed, the woman stirred, her eyelids quivering like fragile petals caught in a breeze. Her voice, brittle as dry twigs, barely reached him. "My name's Maribel Quinn," she murmured. Silas rose swiftly, crossing the room in 2 long strides to kneel at her side. "Silas," he replied, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm of her fragility. Her lips trembled, but no further sound emerged. Her weary eyes drifted past him to the babies, now hushed in the firelight's golden embrace. The smallest one sneezed, a tiny, unexpected sound, and Maribel's gaze filled with unshed tears, silent rivulets tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. Her body, too shattered to weep aloud, bore its grief in stillness. Silas stood and moved to the shadowed corner of the room, retrieving a heavy fur cloak elk hide, lined with the softest rabbit fur from an old trunk. Folding it with care, he placed it beneath the sleeping infants, crafting a warmer, gentler nest. When he glanced back, Maribel's eyes were on him, watching in silence. Words felt unnecessary. A slow, solemn nod passed between them. He returned to the hearth, tossing more wood onto the flames, watching as sparks danced upward like fleeting dreams into the dark. As the ghostly dance of fireflies faded into the soot-darkened rafters of the cabin, a profound stillness settled over the room. Time seemed to hold its breath, marked only by the gentle crackle of the fire, the mournful whisper of the wind beyond the walls, and the uneven, fragile breathing of 4 souls clawing their way back from the brink of oblivion. In the dim hours that followed, Silas knelt by the hearth, stoking the flames one final time before surrender to rest. It was then that her voice pierced the quiet once more, not louder, but resolute, carrying a weight of unyielding certainty. "You didn't abandon us," she said. Silas offered no response, his gaze fixed on the heart of the fire. As the snow wailed against the cabin's sturdy frame, the merciless cold kept at bay, if only for a fleeting moment. Outside, the storm had eased into a tender lull. Snowflakes drifted down in silent reverence, the ferocious wind now a mere memory, leaving a profound hush that cloaked the cabin like a mourner's veil. Within, the fire burned low, its warm amber glow painting fleeting shadows across the rugged timber walls. Marble rested, propped against a makeshift bed of folded blankets, a faint flush of life returning to her cheeks, though cruel bruises still marred her skin like spilled ink. Her voice, roughened by the cold and tears, rasped with effort, yet she spoke. Silas, seated close by, honed a blade against a damp stone, each stroke deliberate, almost meditative. He asked no questions, not her name, not the source of her pain, nor why she had been forsaken to death's embrace. That silence, in its quiet way, was a balm. "I was 17 when I wed Joseph Quinn," Marbell murmured, her words slicing through the stillness with fragile clarity. "He was 34, a man of wealth and influence. My father called me fortunate." Silas's hands never faltered, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone unbroken. "At first, I believed it too." She pressed on, her voice a thread of memory. "He took me to a grand house with towering windows and floors of polished marble. I draped myself in silk, slept on pillows of down. But he, as the echoes of past pain lingered from our earlier confessions, Maribel's voice trembled with a raw, unspoken grief. She hesitated, her eyes drifting to the slumbering infants by the hearth, their delicate breaths weaving a tender symphony in the quiet. "He never touched me with the kindness a husband owes," she murmured, her words heavy with sorrow. "With my first daughter, he scowled. With the second, he turned silent, a wall of disdain. And the third," her voice shattered like fragile glass, "when she came, he spat venom at the midwife, claiming my womb was cursed. He sneered to his kin that I was no better than a barren beast, worthless without a son." Silas, who had been a quiet sentinel, lifted his gaze, his eyes a harbor of calm resolve. Maribel's face tilted, unveiling a ghostly scar tracing her jaw, a silent testament to brutality. "That night, they struck me," she whispered, her hands quivering as if reliving the blows. "I thought death would claim me, but instead, he hauled me to the ancient fence post, binding me there in the merciless cold. He called it justice, saying if the snow spared me, I was fated to endure." Her fingers reached instinctively for the basket, cradling her daughters. "They said girls are mere burdens, hungry mouths with no value," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread. Silas laid down his blade, his silence a storm-gathering strength, his jaw clenched, a flicker of restrained fury, before he rose and crossed the cabin floor. "Buzz, as force," his boots whispering against the wood. Kneeling by her cot, he took her battered hand, swollen, scarred, cradling it, as though it were a fragile treasure in his rough, calloused grasp. Looking into her eyes with unwavering certainty, he spoke, his voice a low, resonant vow. "Your daughters, Maribel, are the only ones worth any sacrifice." Tears brimmed in her eyes, and this time she let them spill freely, glistening trails catching the fire's glow, mingling with the soft cadence of her children's slumber. Or, how could such worth be so fiercely denied? As the echoes of the previous night's revelations lingered, Silas remained at her side, his hand clasped around hers, a silent anchor in the storm of their shared uncertainty. Beyond the cabin walls, the snow descended in relentless sheets, cloaking the world in a frigid hush. Yet within these rough-hewn walls, a subtle transformation stirred, not mere warmth, but something profound, a fragile glimmer of hope, the whisper of a vow yet unspoken. Outside, the snow's grip began to loosen, melting at the cabin's edges into dreary gray slush, unveiling the hard, frost-bitten earth beneath. The mountains, ancient and unyielding, seemed to stir from their wintry slumber, and with the tentative breath of spring came not just renewal, but whispers from the valleys below. At the first blush of dawn, a sharp rap shattered the stillness. Silas rose, his frame tense, and opened the door to reveal a woman swathed in a green woolen shawl, her breath curling like smoke in the crisp morning air. Her cheeks glowed crimson from the arduous ascent, and her horse, tethered to a nearby pine, trembled with the strain of the journey. "Morning, Silas," she said, her tone sharp, laced with urgency. "Hattie," he replied, stepping back to usher her inside. Maribel sat near the crackling fire, cradling one of the infants, her gaze flickering briefly to the newcomer before returning to the child. Hattie spared her a fleeting look, then fixed her attention on Silas as the door thudded shut. "It's about her," she began, her words heavy with portent. "Lo, Joseph Quinn's spreading tales. He claims she fled in a frenzy, that she's unhinged. He insists the babies are his by right, hidden away in defiance of the law." Maribel's eyes widened, her grip tightening on the babe. What cruel lies would tear a mother from her own? Hattie pressed on. He's hired men, 4 of them. They say they're just bringing her home, but their ride speaks of menace, not mercy." Silas gave a single stoic nod, his silence a fortress. Hattie's gaze darted between them, her voice a urgent murmur. "I rode up the moment I heard. They'll track this place down, and when they come, they won't hesitate." As the weight of the previous moment lingered, Maribel lifted her eyes to Silas, a flicker of something unspoken shadowing her gaze. Hattie, caught in a heartbeat of doubt, reached into the folds of her weathered coat and drew out a small leather pouch. Inside were dried lentils, tough strips of jerky, and a flask of fiery spirits. "Take it," she urged softly, her voice a quiet plea. "You'll need every bit of strength." Silas accepted it with a wordless nod, the gesture heavy with unspoken gratitude. Soon after, Hattie slipped away, leaving a void in her wake. The day unfolded in a blur of purposeful action. Silas mended the latch on the rear window with steady hands, fortified the door with an extra crossbar, and piled firewood beside the hearth to spare Maribel the chill of the outdoors. He hauled supplies down to the root cellar, a silent preparation for hiding or escape. Words were scarce. His focus was a fortress. With meticulous care, he honed his hunting knife until its blade shimmered like moonlight on water, then secured it in the sheath at his belt, a constant, quiet threat. When night descended, sleep was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Dawn brought an eerie stillness, the air thick with an unnatural hush. Even the birds held their breath. Then the distant thunder of hooves broke the silence. 4 sets, deliberate and menacing. Maribel drew her daughters into a protective embrace, her heart a drum of fear. Silas, resolute, swung open the cabin door and stepped into the open. The riders emerged from the mist, their slow approach chilling, faces obscured beneath broad-brimmed hats. They halted just beyond the steps. The leader, marked by a jagged scar across his cheek, bore a revolver at his hip. "Silas Granger," he barked, voice cold as iron. "We've got a claim." Silas stood unyielding. "That woman in there is Joseph Quinn's wife, his property. We're here to take her and those girls." Silas didn't flinch, his stance relaxed yet defiant, unarmed but unbreakable. His voice cut through the tension, steady and piercing. "She was never his, and she damn well isn't yours." The scarred man's sneer twisted with contempt. "Think this ends here, mountain man?" Silas's gaze was a blade of its own. "Care to find out? Come back and see." The 4 riders stared, their silence a storm waiting to break. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken threats, as the lead rider's gaze held for a heartbeat too long. Then, with a sharp tug on his reins, he growled, "Let's move. Not worth the trouble today." They thundered off, snow erupting in their wake, yet the glint in their eyes swore they'd be back. Silas remained rooted at the doorway, staring into the emptiness long after their figures dissolved into the wintry haze. Inside, Maribel released a trembling breath, her arms still wrapped tight around her daughters. Her heart roared like a storm within her chest. Safety, for now, was theirs, but the dark tendrils of the lowlands still clawed toward their mountain sanctuary. Would they ever truly escape? Spring crept over the rugged slopes with a tender touch, melting the stubborn snow and teasing emerald shoots from barren limbs. The days grew expansive, and the cabin, once a mere shield against winter's icy grip, began to whisper of home. Maribel carried herself with a newfound steadiness, her steps no longer faltering. The howl of the wind or the snap of burning wood no longer made her shrink. She found solace in small, axe-stirring humble stews over the hearth, from pine roots, wild onions, and whatever bounty Silas hauled back from the forest. Sometimes earthy mushrooms, sometimes a lean rabbit, once a proud wild turkey, though more often it was grouse. Her 3 little ones, Eloise, Ruth, and June, blossomed with each passing week. Their cheeks rounded, their cries transformed into melodies, sweet and bold, like fledglings testing their wings. They slumbered in a tender row, nestled in beds of coyote fur and hay, softened by scraps of an old quilt Silas had kept untouched until now. Dawn brought a sacred hush. Maribel would stir before the first light, tending the fire and watching over her girls. Silas, ever the shadow, would already be gone hunting or tending traps, leaving no word, yet always returning. Their exchanges remained few, not distant, but soft, like 2 souls deciphering the quiet poetry of each other's presence. He never pried into her past again. She kept the pain locked away, unspoken, as if the words were relics entombed beneath a frozen shroud. They both understood that some wounds could not be mended, only endured with quiet resolve. Yet in the midst of their shared silence, faint glimmers of solace began to emerge, fragile as the first buds of spring. One crisp afternoon, Maribel came upon Silas at the weathered workbench just beyond the cabin's shadow. His coat lay discarded, the sleeves of his faded flannel pushed back to reveal sinewy, time-worn forearms. In his hands, a carving knife danced over a slender piece of cedar, each stroke deliberate and tender. She lingered wordlessly, captivated by the rhythm of his craft, and though his eyes remained on the wood, she felt the weight of his awareness. That night, her breath caught at the sight of his creation. 3 modest wooden plaques, each barely the length of a palm, now adorned the space above the baby's resting place. Etched into them, in meticulous script, were the names Eloise, Ruth, June. Every letter had been smoothed with care, the wood polished with oil until it shimmered in the fire's warm glow. Maribel's hand flew to her lips, stifling a sob. How could it be that no one, not even her closest blood, had ever honored her daughters with such permanence? Now their names hovered like sacred whispers, a testament to memory. As the days melted into hues of amber and emerald, Maribel found her voice again, weaving soft lullabies for the girls under the evening sky, melodies her mother once sang, while braiding her hair with gentle hands. Silas, ever near, perched by the doorway, his tall frame resting against the frame, sharpening a blade or tending his rifle, always attuned to her song. One night, as the wind heralded rain and the air grew heavy with the scent of earth and pine, Maribel stirred a pot over the crackling fire, a hum escaping her lips. Silas sat close, cleaning rabbit pelts with steady hands. Then, unbidden, unplanned, she uttered his name, not just a fragment, but the full, resonant weight of it. Silas Granger. The room seemed to hold its breath. He froze, his movement ceasing as if time itself had paused. Slowly he turned to face her, his hands falling still at his sides. In the flickering glow of the fire, his eyes captured the light, burning like embers that had long awaited a spark to reignite. For a moment, he remained silent, simply gazing at her, truly seeing her, as though the sound of his name on her lips had stirred something deep within his soul. Maribel met his stare, her eyes steady now, carrying a quiet strength she hadn't possessed before. "I never thanked you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the way I should have." Silas stood, his presence as hushed as ever, and took a cautious step closer, though he refrained from reaching out. His gaze drifted to the simmering pot on the hearth, then to the sleeping girls curled up behind her, before returning to her face. "You didn't have to," he replied, his words simple yet weighted with unspoken meaning. A profound silence stretched between them, not strained, not uncertain, but brimming with emotions too vast to voice just yet. It lingered in the air, in the warmth of the fire, in the fragile space they shared. Then Maribel's lips curved ever so slightly, a faint smile that didn't promise all was mended, but whispered of a new beginning. And Silas Granger, a man of so few words since the day they'd met, offered a single nod before returning to his seat. Outside, the wind howled with growing ferocity. Rain had yet to fall, but its arrival was inevitable. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low and constant, wrapping them in a quiet that felt like the truest peace. Had such stillness ever held so much promise? As dusk deepened, the storm descended, swift and merciless across the mountain. The wind turned vicious, the sky a blinding, raging white. Snow lashed against the cabin's walls in relentless sheets, thick enough to bury footprints in mere moments, fierce enough to disorient a man mere steps from shelter. Within, the fire crackled and sputtered, while the windows rattled under the storm's unrelenting fury. As the bitter wind howled outside, Silas lingered near the rear wall, meticulously securing the final shutter with calloused hands. Maribel, meanwhile, cradled Ruth and June in a protective embrace, her frame a shield against the encroaching dread. By the flickering fire, Eloise slumbered peacefully, oblivious to the suffocating tension that gripped the room. Suddenly, Silas stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. With cautious steps, he approached the frost-kissed window, scraping away the icy veil with the back of his knuckles. Peering into the relentless blizzard, his heart sank. There, emerging from the swirling chaos, were 3 figures horsemen, cloaked and resolute, their heads bowed against the ferocious gale. They advanced with chilling determination, as if the mountain itself bent to their will. Silas recoiled from the glass, his voice a hushed tremor, as he uttered, "It's them." Maribel's breath hitched, a silent gasp of terror. She didn't need to ask who he meant. The raw fear etched into Silas's face confirmed her worst nightmare. Joseph had tracked them down, his gaze locked with hers, urgent and unyielding. "Take the girls. Follow the creek. Stay low. Don't stop. Don't return unless it's with the law." Her eyes widened in disbelief, but before a protest could form, Silas was already in motion. He darted to the corner, retrieving an old elk fur cloak and draping it over her trembling shoulders. Into her satchel, he stuffed jerky, dried apples, and a small flask, essentials for the harrowing journey ahead. Then, with a grave expression, he pressed a small blade into her palm, no longer than her hand. "Keep it close. If they catch up, don't hesitate." Her lips quivered as she stared at him, a storm of fear and questions in her eyes. "And you?" she whispered. "I'll lead them away," he replied, brushing a fleeting kiss on Eloise's forehead before urging Maribel once more. "Go now." With Ruth and June bundled in her arms and one strapped to her back, Maribel slipped out the back, disappearing into the shadowed embrace of the trees. Silas watched the door creak shut, a hollow ache in his chest. Then, without hesitation, he set to work crafting a decoy from a spare coat and a broomstick, tethering it to a fence with desperate ingenuity. How long could he hold them off? As the echoes of the previous night's tension lingered in the frigid air, Silas positioned himself near the southern trail, his heart pounding with grim determination. Under the cover of dusk, he kindled an oil lamp, its flickering glow hidden behind a weathered log to weave deceptive shadows across the snow. He guided his faithful horse partway down the path, securing its reins to a gnarled tree, as though abandoned in a frantic escape. Further along, at the trail's curve, he sparked a modest fire, its tendrils of smoke curling upward, a subtle lure, its warmth a deliberate distraction. With every detail in place, he retreated to the cabin, his breath visible in the icy stillness, awaiting the inevitable. The knock shattered the silence, sharp and foreboding. Silas swung the door open to face three figures, cloaked in snow and menace. At their forefront stood Joseph Quinn, his features unchanged, still striking with that icy, calculated charm, though his gaze was sharper, more merciless than the howling gale at his back. "Stoker," he hissed, his words cutting through the storm like a blade. "She stole what's mine. Those girls bear my name." Silas stepped onto the frostbitten porch, sealing the cabin behind him. "You've trekked through this hell for nothing but lies," he challenged, his voice steady. "I fled because you let her perish. She's mine." Joseph's snarl was venomous as he drew a pistol, its barrel glinting in the dim light. Silas stood resolute, unarmed, his defiance a silent roar. "She belongs to no one but herself." Joseph's face contorted with rage. "This is your last warning." Unyielding, Silas replied, "Then pull the trigger." A henchman surged forward, slamming the butt of his rifle into Silas's shoulder. He stumbled, crashing against the doorframe, collapsing to one knee as snow seeped into his shirt, a scarlet stain spreading like wildfire. Joseph advanced, weapon poised, when a commanding voice pierced the night. "Drop it!" A lantern swayed from a nearby tree, and Sheriff Mather emerged, flanked by deputies, rifles at the ready. Joseph spun around, only to see Maribel, her cloak ragged, her face fierce, stepping from the shadowed woods. How could fate turn so swiftly in this frozen crucible of vengeance? Asky resolve glittered in Maribel's eyes as she stood firm in the snow, her voice cutting through the bitter air like a blade. "Tell them what you did," she demanded, her tone unyielding and sharp. "Or I swear I will." Joseph stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his breath catching in his throat. Nearby, the sheriff's horse let out a restless snort, steam rising from its nostrils. "Arrest him," Mather commanded with a steely edge. Isef's gun clattered to the frozen ground as the deputies swung down from their mounts, their boots crunching in the snow. They seized the three men, binding their wrists with cold iron cuffs and hauling them away, indifferent to Joseph's feeble protests, his voice fracturing under the weight of shock and betrayal. Maribel's heart raced as she stumbled through the drifts to Silas, who lay crumpled against the cabin door, crimson blood seeping from his shoulder, staining the snow beneath him. She fell to her knees beside him, tears shimmering in her eyes, though her gaze held no trace of despair. "You're not dying," she declared fiercely. "Do you hear me, Silas?" He groaned, his breath shallow and uneven, but managed a gruff, "Not planning on it." Her lips trembled with relief. "Good," she whispered, pressing her trembling hand against the wound to stem the flow of blood. "Because I refuse to bury the only man who stood as a shield between us and damnation." Silas peered up at her through the haze of pain, and somehow a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Knew you'd come back," he murmured. As winter relented, spring tiptoed into the valley, coaxing wildflowers from the softened earth and drawing robins to trill from the pine boughs. The tempest of violence had passed, and though the scars lingered on flesh, in memory and in the fragile bond between two souls who had nearly lost all, they began to mend. Silas's shoulder healed at a painstaking pace, tended daily by Maribel's steady, gentle hands as she wrapped fresh bandages around the wound. He bore the pain without a word of complaint. She cared for him without unnecessary fuss. Life had dealt them a brutal hand, hadn't it? Yet here they stood, defiant, breathing, piecing together fragments of hope from the wreckage. With the shadow of danger lifted, they turned their hands to rebuilding the cabin. What had once been a mere refuge against the storm now blossomed into a true home. Silas labored to extend the east wall, crafting space for a grander hearth to warm their nights. Maribel, with a quiet pride, painted the shutters a soft, weathered green, using the last dregs of pigment from a can Hattie had salvaged from town. Together they transformed their sanctuary, and soon a new purpose stirred in their hearts. Why not open their doors to weary travelers? There were always wanderers in need of shelter, men and women seeking respite on these rugged paths. As the trade trail buzzed with life fur traders bartering pelts, timber haulers trudging with their heavy loads, and ranch hands journeying between counties, whispers began to ripple through the rugged landscape. Near the ridge, just below the second switchback, a sanctuary awaited weary souls, a place known as the Hearth at Granger Ridge. Here, Maribel poured her soul into every meal, crafting dishes that mended both body and spirit. Her venison stew simmered with comfort, the root vegetable hash grounded the heart, and her sweet cornbread, drizzled with golden honey, felt like a tender embrace. Silas, ever the steadfast protector, roamed the woods for game, split logs with relentless vigor, and tended to the stables. His watchful presence ensured no shadow of trouble dared linger near their door. Meanwhile, their 3 daughters blossomed with startling speed. Eloise took her first wobbly steps, a tiny triumph. Ruth uttered her first word, fire, a spark of her fiery spirit. And June, oh sweet June, hummed melodies before her tongue shaped words, her voice a lullaby in the wilderness. Travelers came and went, their laughter weaving into the cabin's very walls, growing richer with each passing dusk. One quiet evening, after the last rider had vanished into the twilight, and the girls slumbered peacefully, Maribel slipped outside. There, on the porch, Silas sat, sanding a rough plank with quiet focus. He glanced up, reached into a worn satchel at his feet, and revealed a treasure, a hand-woven shawl, dyed a deep, soulful burgundy, adorned with intricate dark thread embroidery. In one corner, stitched with painstaking care, were 3 initials, E.R.J. Beneath them, in bold capitals, the word worthy. Her breath hitched as she traced the delicate stitching. "You made this?" she whispered, voice trembling. He nodded softly. "For you," he murmured. "Because you are." Overwhelmed, she clutched the shawl to her heart. A heavy, meaningful silence stretched between them. Then her voice broke the stillness. "You chose us, when you could have walked away. Why?" Silas offered no words in reply. Instead, he stepped closer, took her hand with a tenderness that spoke volumes, and met her gaze. No grand gestures, no proclamations, just an unspoken vow. That night, with the fire's gentle crackle and the mountains standing sentinel in the hush, they sealed a bond deeper than words could ever convey. In the quiet sanctity of their mountain haven, Silas and Maribel bound their lives together, not with gleaming gold or the clamor of a crowd, but with whispered promises and unwavering hearts. As a symbol of their union, Silas presented a humble gift. A string of beads, each one carefully carved and smoothed, tied with simple twine, one for each of their precious daughters. Under the cloak of night, he gently slipped them over the tiny wrists of the sleeping girls. For Maribel, he offered no trinket, only the warmth of his hand. She clasped it, and in that tender grip, she claimed all that truly mattered. No flowers adorned their moment, no priest spoke solemn words, no music swelled, only the crackle of a fire and the presence of 2 souls, and oh, how that was more than enough. Spring had woven its vibrant tapestry across the mountain. The ridge, once cloaked in snow, now bloomed with tender moss and wild violets that crept along the stony path to their cabin. The crisp scent of pine blended with the comforting aroma of wood smoke, wild herbs, and the golden warmth of bread rising in the hearth. Laughter, pure and bright, echoed through the yard as Eloise, Ruth, and June darted around the porch steps, their dresses painted with grass stains and sheer delight. Their sun-kissed hair danced wildly with every gleeful step. From the kitchen window, Maribel gazed upon them, her hands dusted with flour, a gentle smile curving her lips as her heart swelled. How could such simple moments hold so much joy? Granger Ridge had transformed into more than a mere shelter. It had become a beacon, a whispered tale among wanderers and traders. Travelers ascended the winding switchback trail, seeking not just sustenance, but solace, a fleeting taste of home. They gathered at the weathered table, cradling mugs of steaming pine tea while the girls' laughter floated in from outside. Maribel tended to them with a quiet elegance, often tucking a warm roll into a pocket for their onward journey. Meanwhile, Silas labored behind the cabin, nurturing the garden beds he'd crafted with his own hands, rows of potatoes, carrots, squash, and beans, each a testament to their hard-won life. As the day mellowed into a tender hush from the fervor of the previous hours, the little girls drifted into a gentle slumber, their dreams woven with the echoes of laughter. Meanwhile, Marbel, with a heart as vast as the horizon, gathered the village children around a weathered chalkboard, teaching them the magic of letters, with nothing but charcoal and sheer will. Some of these eager souls trekked 5 arduous miles just to absorb her wisdom, while others lingered long after the scribbled words blurred, entranced by the melody of her songs that seemed to carry the soul of the mountains themselves. Each night, the hearth glowed with a flame tended so meticulously, not out of dread for the creeping chill, but as a silent vow to never forget the biting cold they had once endured. One such evening, after the last visitor had bid farewell, Silas settled on the worn porch steps, his boots caked with the earth's honest dust, a basket of freshly picked green beans resting beside him. The sun dipped low, bathing the rolling hills in a golden embrace. Marbel emerged, 2 steaming mugs cradled in her hands, and took her place by his side. In the yard, their daughters scampered about, barefoot and bursting with life, their giggles a symphony against the twilight. She passed him his tea, her hand brushing over his with a tender familiarity, his fingers entwined with hers, a quiet strength in the gesture. Her gaze followed their girls, wild and free under the fading sun, before turning to him, her voice a whisper of warmth. "This fire between us, has it ever truly dimmed?" Silas, eyes fixed on the horizon, the edges of his vision softening with memory, replied, "It only ever needed a home to burn bright." They lingered there, hands clasped, as the sky painted itself in shades of lavender and the first shy stars pierced the dusk. To any passerby, the depth of their saga marked by blood, storms, and relentless struggle remained unseen. Yet in the curve of her smile, in the steadfast way he beheld her, and in the joyous dance of their 3 girls under a sliver of mountain light, one could sense an indomitable force. What stood here wasn't forged from riches or conflict, but from a fierce, enduring love, a love that weathered the harshest of winters and chose to stay, unyielding and beautiful. How could such a bond not stir the heart? In a realm scorched by fire and chilled by frost, a love story emerged that defied the odds. Silas and Marbel, in a world where fairness was a distant dream and warmth a fleeting whisper, showed us that the most enduring shelters are forged not from wood or brick, but from unwavering trust, selfless sacrifice, and the courage to hold on when surrender seemed simpler. Can you imagine such resilience? If their tale has stirred your soul, if it whispers that even in the bleakest corners, love can bloom defiant and strong, then join us. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more gripping odysseys into the raw, untamed heart of the American frontier, where bullets may stray, but hearts always find their mark. Hit that bell to ensure you never miss a narrative that might linger in your thoughts for a lifetime. To every viewer who has journeyed with us through this saga, thank you from the depths of our hearts. Your presence means the world. Please share your thoughts in the comments, give us a like if this story touched you, spread the word to kindred spirits, and subscribe to keep these tales alive. Together, let's keep the spirit of the frontier burning bright.